221 of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies for the casual spike. My name is Stanislav here in Manchester, and with me on the line from the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts, it's d00mwake, aka Devon O'Donnell. Devon, I thought you were in Rhode Island.
No, Massachusetts the whole time.
The whole time?
Maybe until I eventually move to Rhode Island, but who knows? Maybe that'll be in the near future. But yeah, Massachusetts, the great Commonwealth.
Weird. I've been
Or something like that.
misallocating you. I've been telling all my friends, "Oh, you
Close
gotta be
enough.
my Rhode Island buddy." The smallest state
Does
with
that
the
make
biggest
me?
heart.
Does that make me less of a celebrity now that I'm from Mass instead of Rhode Island?
Yeah, like
It's a smaller pool, as everybody knows.
yeah, it's like when you're from Massachusetts, you have to compete with like Ben Affleck, Matt Damon, some other
true.
people. Also with us, The Godfather, Dave Harbarger. Dave, you're from Ohio, which is like it's like the Massachusetts of the Midwest, right?
I don't think Massachusetts appreciates that analogy very much. And to be honest, I like a lot of people from Massachusetts, but the Boston sports teams are some of my least favorite teams that are around. I hate the Red Sox. I don't really like the Patriots. Anyway, we talk about some other time. It is early, folks. Team.
Maybe for you.
It is.
It's 6:30 a.m. in Chicago. It is 7:30 a.m. in Massachusetts. Stan, it's the middle of the day for you. Glad we can get this working.
GMT.
We are hopping on a little bit early so that Devon can go and play the Pioneer Showcase Challenge right after this. Is that right?
Yes, thank you to both of you for accommodating the schedule. It's it's the Pioneer Showcase. Yeah, gonna be hopefully I'll do well, but.
Yeah, fingers crossed. I saw last night that you were registered for it already. When I was on Magic Online, that event got fed to me, and I was like, "Oh, look at that! d00mwake's already in here. Got his tickets in. Don't want to get sold out." I did want to say my wife actually said that us moving it this early made her day. So I actually appreciate you guys moving it to this time as well, because now we can go do some other stuff during the middle of the day. So 6:30 every week. Is that what we're doing from now on?
Sure.
No difference to Stan, right?
Right.
My kid is napping right now. It was really perfect. I'll get to record an entire pod during nap time, I think.
Perfect.
All right, on this week's show, we're going to keep diving into Pioneer in a post March with the Machines world. We're going to go through some of the decks that Devon has had success with so far. It's a Pioneer Deckfest brought to you by d00mwake. And we've tried some of them, Dave and myself have too. So we're going to share our experiences and bounce our ideas off of Devon's head. And then we're going to take a quick trip through Modern with some comprehensive data shared by one of MTG Twitter's best stat sharers, Anil Yahi. Shared a lot of really interesting insights from the post-Yorion ban metagame. So we have a lot of data there to talk through. But before all that, let's do some housekeeping. We have a new patron to join the Dive Down Nation by the name of Dive Down Fan. That's their name on Patreon. I'll take it.
That's unbelievable.
It must be a fan.
Yeah.
I wonder if they've had that for a while and they're just like a fan of like spelunking and scuba, and then they found our pod.
Does that mean a C&D is coming with them for their podcast called The Dive Down as well?
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. We should
Not
litigate.
Again.
Thank you, Dive Down Fan, for joining the Dive Down Nation. We also got a new review from Greg MMI. Thanks, Greg. We appreciate you. Refer to us as a chill MTG pod. We are pretty chill.
Devon, are you chill?
I do say so myself.
I'm like kind of chill.
You're kind of chill.
On certain days, depending on what time of the day it is.
How about at 7:30 a.m. Eastern?
I feel like I'm pretty chill at 7:30 because I don't really, not a lot going on up there.
Right. Fair. That's why we have good notes. Make sure we get those brains firing. All right. And so if you would like to support us on Patreon, check us out at patreon.com/thedivedown. You can also support us directly with some merch. If you want to buy a hat, a shirt, we have some new shirts coming. I keep saying they are coming soon. I promise. That's at divedown.com, thedivedown.com/store. There is a bunch of Patreon swag that is just about done. Going to show up at Shane's house in the next week or so. So we should be putting together tokens, pins, stuff like that we owe people soon. Playmats boxes will go out at the same time. I know that people have been waiting for a while for some of those things to happen. We're about to do a big merch dump, as we call it, or swag dump, I guess, to a lot of people. So keep an eye on your mailboxes for that.
So swag dump.
Great. That we're gonna get cease and desist from my other podcast. That's my secret
drop.
revenue stream. If you want to support us as well by playing Magic Online, check out Mana Traders. Mana Traders is the best way to rent Magic cards. The Dive Down 2023 to get 10% off of your first 2 months of card rentals. You can go to Barrister and Mann, our lovely skincare partner, and get 15% off your first order. Dive Down 2023. We'll do a little more discussion about what's going on with Barrister and Mann a little later in the show. And then if you want to go help out our friends at Nerd Rage Gaming, they want to help you buy some paper cards. Use code DIVE8 and get 8% off. I will say, if you go check out Norm and the team right now at Nerd Rage Gaming, I saw on Twitter that they won Best Game Store of the Year. I'm not sure who issued this particular award to them, but they were doing a bit of a sale around that. It might only been this weekend, but go check it out. Nerd Rage Gaming, they're great people. They help out Magic players around Chicago and the upper Midwest quite a bit. So, Nerd Rage Gaming. Let's hop right into some talk about Modern really quick before we get into Pioneer. Like Stan said at the beginning of the show, we had one of those incredible data dump tweets come out from Anil Yahi, who is someone who I think is worth keeping an eye on Twitter. Does a lot of kind of, I don't know if it's necessarily advanced, but comprehensive stats kind of sharing occasionally once every couple months. This is a 6-month sample that covers all the time from Yorion being banned until today. So the dates on this data is 10/10/2022 to 4/24/2023. You should check it out on Twitter. It's Yahi Anil. It's just in a tweet. It's 4 images in a tweet. And here's what the images were. One was a matchup grid with wins and loss data for a whole bunch of different decks, maybe the top 14, 15 decks or so. Another thing was a win rate chart with confidence intervals. So you can just check out the actual confidence intervals of the calculations that went into finding these win rates. A prevalence data chart showing what the metagame is made up of, and then a scatter plot chart that kind of combined all those things into one thing that Anil then laid tiers on top of, which was pretty interesting to see. We're not going to go through a ton of the data here, but I did want to mention a couple of things that I kind of felt like I learned looking at it, and get Devon and Stan's reactions to those things, see what they thought about these conclusions coming from the data. The first thing I think we have to start with, if we look at this, is going to be prevalence. So this is just the simplest thing in the world. This is what the modern metagame is. The thing is, over the last 6 months, the modern metagame is exactly what you think it would be, I think, and it's not too surprising except for maybe one thing. So when I looked at this group, there's like 30 decks on this list that Anil put together this chart. It's a big, percentage chart, bar chart, basically. There's really 2 groups for me, or 3 groups. There's people above 5% of the meta, there's decks that are below 5% of the meta, and then there's decks that are below 2% of the 2.5% of the meta is kind of where I drew the line. And when you do that, what you get is a top 11 plus kind of other. And the top 11 is what it is. The top 11 is Murktide at 11.5%, Hammer Time at 8.6%, Creativity at 8.4%, Scam at 6.5%, and Footfalls at 6.5%, and then Scam at 6.1%. Yeah, early in the morning. So here it is, top 5%. I mean, these are the decks that we've been talking about. This is the class of the meta. The only thing that was a little surprising to me was that Murktide, over such a large sample, is basically 3% more than everything else, and it's the only deck that's above 10%. Stan, thoughts? Devon?
There's even kind of that gap between, Murktide and the next 2. So you have 11.5, then the 8.6, 8.4, and then Gap 6.5, 6.1. So you could even kind of split it up into Murktide tier 1, Hammer Time Creativity 1.5, Footfall Scam 1.75 or something like that.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty clearly different between the 2 of them. But I think this matches everybody's personal experience. It matches every challenge we look at for the most part. Certainly Murktide's always there. Hammer Time and Footfalls and Scam tend to go up and down just a little bit, but I'm not surprised that this is the group that we're looking at that are the most popular decks right now. Creativity is the one thing that was a little bit of a surprise to me to see it in 3rd place here, when I feel like 3 or 4 months ago, Creativity had kind of fallen off pretty heavily, And then now it's kind of come back with a real kind of authority, and it's definitely in that top 3. And you see it in those events much more than a few months ago.
I think with regard to creativity, it's also worth noting that like this is a post Yorion environment, and there was a while where creativity was shining. I think in the Yorion metagame, where it was one of the most proactive matchups that like could outplay the Yorion Omnath piles. So, if anything, like I think this is like reflecting that slight metagame decline when creativity began to struggle and like when Scam and Murktide and Hammer perhaps were like the strongest decks immediately after Yorion's ban.
Yeah, I feel like this is showing the bounce back of creativity too, as it's gotten back into popularity as well. So it went down and then it's come back up. And I think you'll see in a little bit, as far as the tiering data and win rate data, that there's some interesting stuff there too. All right, in that section between 2.5 and 5%, there's 6 decks really. So realistically, I think there's a top 11 in Modern as far as prevalence goes, and then everything else kind of goes from there. So you have Burn at 4.8%, Amulet Titan at 4%, Yawgmoth at 2.9%, Grinding Breach at 2.8%, Living at 2.5%, and then after that, you're basically at 2% or below for everything else that's here. This is not too much of a surprise either. I feel like these decks are really familiar to people. There might be a couple of things that are missing here. Value Breach isn't in the top 11, for example. Prowess isn't in the top 11, which seems to come and go a little bit. Domain Zoo is hanging on right on the edge of that top 11, but didn't really make it into it. So there's some decks that are a little bit missing from here. Omnath control kind of stuff is not in this top 11 anywhere, even though I think it's shown good results lately. But this second tier is certainly decks that we've seen for a long time. I guess the only three things that are surprising me about this is that people won't stop playing Burn. For one, we've talked about this many times. Amulet and Yogg being this small is a little bit of surprise, but also, I do think we don't see them quite as much as we have in the last couple of years. But that's the meta. I feel like this is no surprise to anybody.
And this tier kind of feels to me like the one bad matchup tier. So if you go down the list, you have Burn, really bad against creativity, or can be bad against.
It's bad against Murktide. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you have Amulet Titan bad against Murktide, Yawgmoth bad against Footfalls. And so you kind of have like that. These decks all have that one Achilles heel, and I don't feel like the top tier kind of has that. They have a much better matchup spread. So that's kind of like what this tier feels like to me.
Yeah.
What do you guys see as the difference between elementals and Omnath control? Because I feel like those decks have more in common than not. And is it just like having counterspells versus not having counterspells? Because a lot of the creature package remains the same.
So I think the Omnath control deck is like blue. I think that's more like blue-white splash Ren Omnath, I think is what it is. And then the elementals deck is like, Kahira. I'm going to reveal Kahira, Endurance, Solitude, Fury, less counterspell. I think that's the difference, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, and we don't have deck lists to go with these in front of me, but I'd assume that's correct too. I will say the reason I mentioned like Omnath Control has had some really good matchups lately, but yeah, it's been interesting that people haven't picked it up. It's had good results, but we'll see. Okay, so one other thing that I thought was interesting is that there's 24 more decks on this list, basically, and I mentioned a few of them earlier, between that 2.1% and 0.5% of the meta where Anile stopped his sample. The thing that's really interesting is that it's a lot of diversity still at this bottom end. It's a really long tail in Modern. I think a lot of these decks are pretty good. All of these decks, I believe, use Modern Horizon cards heavily in one way or another, and I think that this is more of that fodder to just go like, you can't really have a deck in Modern these days without cards that are powerful from Modern Horizons being at least some part of it, one of the Modern Horizons sets. But I do think that there's still a lot of, there's a lot of options. It's just like you got to put that play set of that one card from Modern Horizons in your deck to have it keep up with the power level of everything else in the format. It is what it is. Like at this point, it's not like we can make that go away unless you have your own special tournament because you're a Magic content creator who has enough fans to do that, Devon. But that
sounds like something familiar to me.
It does. Hey, what won the most recent? By the way, we had you on to talk about your your earlier, like your mono Modern tournaments.
Yeah.
What won this time? Do you remember?
You're actually going to like this. It was the Abzan Devoted Druid deck.
Oh, that's right. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And honestly, it kind of makes sense because it's a deck that doesn't really use a ton of I think most of the list play Saga, but you don't need it 100%.
Yeah.
And Tyvar was a huge upgrade to that deck.
Yeah, especially in a world without the cheap interaction that Modern Horizons brings. The story of the win percentages is a little bit more strange to me when you look at it. There's nothing that's really crushing it in aggregate. This is kind of hard for you guys to see. I know the percentages here, but I have a couple of notes here. So the two decks with the highest overall win rate when adjusting for the sample in this kind of like scatter plot chart are Creativity with 54.6% and Grinding Breach with 53.9% win rate in isolation.
Which I think, if anything, probably like speaks to how really the difference highlights the difference between Creativity and Breach, and maybe especially highlights like why Creativity is such a strong option right now, because Creativity is on the highly present end of the spectrum,
right?
With a 8.3% presence compared to Breach, which is 2.8. So even though they're like within striking distance of one another in terms of win rate, Creativity is both really popular and still winning a lot, which probably just speaks to the fact that like it's good against hate, or people aren't bringing in adequate hate to deal with it, or it just has a lot of good matchups.
We're going to talk about that in a second, because the matchup grid is maybe the most interesting part of this whole thing. I will say, even if no decks are really crushing it, like nobody's above the 55%. There are decks that are getting crushed, though, if you look at some of the other win rate data here. And that includes, of course, old favorites, Tron, Burn, Jund Mid, Mill, and Infect, who are all in the low to mid 40s at best. Even though they're just popping up, they're around, they're all in that kind of like, Burn is in the top 10. Those other decks are just outside the top 10. It's like all these old decks getting crushed, and they're just the ones that haven't benefited the most from Modern Horizons. I think really, like, none of them really have benefited a ton from those sets, and it kind of is what it is.
Yeah, like if you look at, Burn, Tron, and Mill, do they even really play that many Horizons cards in any of... I don't really think they do.
I don't think so. Yeah. It's unfortunate. I mean, Jund obviously does, because it's turned itself into a Saga Ragavan deck for the most part, but it's interesting that mid-range strategy, of course, doesn't really work unless you're scamming people, essentially. And then finally, of the win rates in isolation, Murktide has the most Murktide bottom number when it comes to it. 49% win rate, Murktide.
It also has the most presence.
Yeah, by far.
So I wonder if this could also be an example of like, as it gains more popularity, its win rate goes down because it's just such a difficult deck to pilot.
Yeah. Well, that's a transition to my next note, actually. So this win rate data is wild because it is 6 months of matches. We don't totally know exactly how all of the different data was configured in this study. Like, let's call it a study, right? But some of these matchups have 100 matches in them, 200 matchups in them. So I feel like the numbers that we have in this matchup grid, which you should check up on Twitter, like I said, look up, we'll link to it in the show notes, of course, so you can check out the thread. But the biggest thing to me, like 3 things stood out to me about this win rate data, and I thought was pretty interesting. Murktide is around 50% matchups against basically everything. It's sub 50 versus Hammer, Creativity, Footfalls, Elemental, Breach, Living End, Zoo, Merfolk, and is sub 50 against Other with 1,600 matches stored. It's around 49% against Other. It's around 50% against Scam, Yogg, and Tron. It crushes Burn and Titan. I'm sorry, people who like to write into us and say that Burn is good against Murktide. Maybe you're having personal success, but in this sample, Murktide has a 57.3% win rate against Burn with 260 matches, I think, 260 matches in that sample by itself. Yeah. So, but here's the thing. Those are its 2 best matchups. Everything else is kind of subpar. I don't get why people are still playing this deck at 11%, 11% of the field. Do you all have thoughts about that?
It's just like the Delver effect, right? People enjoy casting, these... I don't want to use the T word because we love the T word on this show, right. But people enjoy casting, cheap threats, counter spells, cantrips, stuff like that. That's just what people like to do. And, even though the deck, it's almost like the same thing as Delver and Legacy. I don't think Delver has like this obscenely powerful win rate. It's just people like casting Brainstorm and Forcible and Wasteland in Days, It's like the same thing here, I think.
There's clearly deck masters out there who do well. There's Twinless Twin, who always does very well, and some of the other people on the energy circuit who kill it online, with Murktide. So I don't know if there's just that huge of a skill gap in the deck.
I mean, we do continue to see it appear in top 8s fairly frequently, and yeah, I mean, I think this is the deck that like probably is among the more rewarding ones to master, because the interactions are so fun, and like, Ragavan getting out of control and like either stealing opponents' cards or just like getting you ahead on mana like crazy is always like just a fun way to make your opponents miserable. And I think even when you're losing, it always feels like it's close, right? Like I don't think there are too many, because everything is like within a few percent of 50 plus or minus 50% with Murktide. I feel like even when you're losing, you're not hating it, just because like it always seems like it's within reach until someone pulls ahead.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
that's to answer your question of like, why do people keep going back to Murktide? Because like, I think you're literally chasing the big blue dragon,
right?
Constantly.
The big blue dragon. Creativity is kind of the inverse, by the way. It has risen up in prominence, but I think people aren't talking about it quite as much as you talk about Murktide and some of the other staple decks. But it has the best isolated matchup data against meta decks. It looks like it's better, 50% or better against 9 of the other 13 top decks. Its bad matchups are unfavored, but they're only in the low 40s. They're not getting into a spot where they're in the high 30s, where they're really getting crushed by anything. It's kind of the inverse of Murktide right now. And I feel like, for me, I've had like a love-hate relationship with creativity, but maybe it's time to give it another try again, because I don't want to play. I like Murktide, but I don't want to play it because I know I'm one of those bad Murktide pilots. Last thing that I thought was interesting was Scam has this weirdly polarized meta where if you look at it, it's sub 50% win rate against the other top tier of decks. So against Murktide, against Hammer, against Creativity, against Footfalls, it's not doing very well against those decks. However, it crushes everything else. And so kind of weird and interesting.
Well, it's also like, okay, this is the Rhino Boys podcast. Scam versus Footfalls, 34.6%. I never
Shocked.
felt like it was that bad when I was like, I thought the matchup was always fairly close when I was playing Rhinos. I don't know how you guys feel about it.
I'm with you. Like I'm so shocked by some of this. The fact that Scam beats up on Murktide is surprising to me. And like, God, like Scam being able to like rush out a Blood Moon faster than Rhinos, like sometimes feels like so intense. The fact that the turn 1 grief plays are like, to me, often feel like lights out for the Rhinos player. Maybe Rhinos just benefits from post board games more than Rakdos does, because like you can just bring in endurance, take out your force of negations, and like you have a strategy. But it's wild. I part of me also wonders if this is like the thing we talk about a lot, where just like Scam runs out of gas really quickly.
Yeah.
Like you have a really powerful turns 1, 2, and sometimes turn 3, and then you sort of run out of cards. And Rhinos potentially, if you fetch well early and you don't like get torn apart by grief, like you can actually cobble together like a good mid to late game strategy, and that's what helps you pull ahead.
Yeah. Scam is actually, according to this data, Rhino's second best matchup next to Yawgmoth, and they're within 3%, like 3 decimal points of each other. One is 65.4% win, the other one is 65.7% win. I did want to put together a little bit of story about Rhinos, since it's the Rhinos podcast, but I couldn't see a through line in this data. Honestly, it's just Rhinos has some really good matchups. It has a lot of solid ones, and it has very few really bad ones other than Living End. It looks like Living End is the flip. Yeah.
We don't want to see that deck.
Yeah.
It stinks, Jerry. Here's one issue I have with the data too. It does not distinguish between 4-color and 3-color Rhinos, and this era of Magic encapsulates both decks. Like we saw a rise in 4-color, and we've since seen a decline in people going back to Temur, I think, to play more Blood Moons, especially, and Murktide, I suppose. And like, unless 4-color Rhinos ended up falling into the other category, potentially, like, I think maybe some of this is mixed.
Because you feel like the matchups between those two builds is very different.
I think so. Yeah, like, I mean, the 4-color version really struggles against Blood Moon in particular, in a way that the Temur version can play against it a little bit more.
And I think conversely, the leyline binding kind of helps the Murktide matchup, whereas I feel four color is maybe a little bit better against Murktide and Teamers a little bit worse. So there's definitely a lot of give and take with the four color versus Teamer stuff. And I've also seen a lot of the people playing main deck disputes now too. So I wonder, it'd be kind of interesting to see how like that would factor into the data. But
yeah, as long as we're on this path, like the Footfalls versus Hammer matchup, like Footfalls is 40.8% against Hammer. Like, Devon, does that feel right to you in all your
no,
experience?
not at all.
Not at all, right?
Not at all.
So I don't know what's going on here, and maybe like our point of view is skewed. Like maybe we figured out a way for us to play that matchup in a way that like bucks the trend, but
Or
I'm
we
sure
just all
everything-
think that Footfalls is broken. So yeah. everything's 70% for us, regardless.
Exactly.
That's also true.
We love it. All right. Well, thanks for taking that little tour of Modern with me. I thought it was an interesting data set to see. And we're going to take a look at Pioneer, some of the decks Devon has been having success with, coming up after a quick break. Stan.
David.
Spring is here. Ring, ring, Stan. Ring, ring. Spring is here, and guess what that means? That means it's time for lots of new activity, scents, and other things from our friends at Barrister and Mann. Exclusive shaving and bathing provider to the dive down, I will say.
That's right. I don't use any other shaving soaps or body products.
At this point,
I guess I use a different shampoo. They don't make shampoo yet, but I will use their shampoo as soon as they let me.
Someday. We're going to get those prototypes soon, right, Will? All right, well, so Will is always releasing new stuff. You can check out barristerandman.com/blogs to see what's going on. But he has a great release schedule article that we're looking at right now. And May is here, and it's time to like maybe freshen up, get ready for spring. And a couple of things are happening. So May 16th, in the middle of the month, he's going to be releasing 2 new scents completely, or not new, but they're going to be available. The samples are coming out on May 2nd, so you can check those out if you want to. It's called Adagio and Presto. We talked about these last week, and those mean walking pace and fast in music terminology generally. If you want to check them out, Adagio is lime, cherry, violet leaf absolute, lily of the valley, musk, and menthol. And then also Presto is nutmeg, lavender, bergamot, tangerine, cedar, violet, lily of the valley, carnation, patchouli, amber. It's got a lot here. Musk. They're going to be available in shaving soap, after splash, aftershave balm, and more. Great for spring. But one thing that was interesting that you got excited about when we were looking at the blog, Stan, lather bowls.
Lather bowls. So one of the things that I first learned when I was doing wet shaving is that you're using shaving soap, so you have to find a way to get it into like the foamy, white, creamy substance that you use to like make your whiskers softer so that they're ready to shave. You know what I mean? And shaving soap, unless you're getting a sample, which is literally a little bar of soap, otherwise it comes in like this round plastic container, and figuring out how to get like the hard soap substance from the plastic container into the creamy substance that you want to lather your face with, there's a number of different ways to do it. What's nice about Barrister and Mann products is you don't technically need a bowl. You can just like pour some water into the shaving soap container, that the round container, and take your brush and start whisking it up, and like with enough moisture, it then produces the foam material, and then you spread it on your face, and then you shave, face or elsewhere, right? But in some cases, a lot of like the true heads will swear by using a bowl to produce your lather, right? And I do find, on the one hand, bowls are really useful when we are using the samples. Like, because the sample comes in a little thin disc that looks like a thin bar of soap, like, it's hard to turn that sample soap into shaving lather unless you put it into another device. But you don't only want bowls if you're using the samples. Like, one of the best ways I think to use a bowl and to like get really high quality thick lather is to kind of go back and forth, where you produce a bunch of lather in your brush, take it to a bowl, and then you keep whisking it so that it gradually gets thicker and less wet, so that you end up with a product that like kind of sort of resembles like whipped cream or the type of lather that you might expect out of an aluminum can of shaving cream. Um, and the nice thing about lather bowls is they just like they contribute to like the sophisticated grooming paraphernalia that goes into wet shaving. So like you have your safety razor or whatever straight razor you use, you have your brush, you have your shaving soap, and then it all comes together with this bowl, which I think also in turn makes your container of shaving soap last a little longer as well, because
Mm-hmm.
you're less likely to be pouring water in there that like kind of then you uh are gradually like eroding the shaving soap bar and probably just getting like more lather and more shaves out of each product that you're getting. So
Wow.
you can use any
I,
bowl. Like I was using a cereal bowl. Like I wasn't at that point. Barrister Man was not selling their own ceramic bowls, um, and like I was using the same bowl that I use for my Cheerios. But you don't want a Cheerio bowl in the bathroom. You want like something chic and elegant, right?
that's right. And my goodness, I was not expecting a 4.5 minute what do they say? Paean is the word? Is that the word? Like the love song, a 4.5 minute freeform love song to bowls. But here we
No
are.
notes. No
That's
notes.
what. No notes. No notes.
That was
Perfect.
off the dome.
That was off the dome. 10 out of 10 bowl love from Stan. And also check out Barrister and Mann for the new scents that they have coming. Adagio Presto in June. They have sent a fragrance named Magard launching, and another one called Lavender Interrupted that sounds very interesting as well. A lot of lavender this spring. And so lavender and violet, it sounds like, are the scents for spring. So go check them out, barristerman.com. Use code DiveDown2023 to get 15% off your first purchase. We appreciate you. All right, we're back. Okay, so we're going to take a look at Pioneer in the post-Mom era from a couple of different perspectives. You know, Stan has recently switched to playing a lot of Pioneer. I've been playing a good amount of Pioneer lately. Devon, of course, has a lot of Pioneer going on in his brain all the time and is getting ready today in 56 minutes to go start the Pioneer Showcase. And so I guess we just want to check in on everybody, see what people were thinking about the format. We have some spicy lists to look at that Stan and I both played, but I want to hand it to Stan for a second because he did manage to get it an F&M and a couple other things recently.
That's true. I did. I finally finished building Azoria spirits in paper, so I took it out to my inaugural F&M. Not great performance by Stan. I went 1 and 2, losing to Phoenix, which is a really difficult matchup to begin with, and losing to Lotus Field, which I did that to myself. I just did not mulligan aggressively and like kept opening hands that were lands and creatures, and I think you kind of have to mulligan to having like 1 to 2 counterspells, and then you can fight through it. But um yeah, Spirit's still fun, and I've noticed it continues to do well, even though it hasn't picked up any cards from Mother.
Yeah. How was the store that you went to? Because I know that it was a new store and kind of a cool area of Manchester. Yeah.
Well, it's not a new store. This is the store that I have been going to.
Oh,
But
okay.
yeah, it's called Fanboy 3. I don't know about Fanboys 1 and 2, but the third one in Manchester's northern quarter is nice. It's funny. I walked in and I know a couple people who play there now, and I was introduced to someone who was drinking a beer from the Mars Brewery, which is a Chicago brewery.
Really?
And yeah, and I guess like he's in some beer club that mails out new beers every month. And the only reason I noticed is because it had the iconic Chicago skyline on the label, and I saw that and I was like, "Hey, that's Chicago." And they're like, "How do you know?" And I'm like, "It's the skyline." And I named some of the buildings, so that was fun.
And he was like, which one was Al Capone buried in? That's what everybody who's not from America thinks about Chicago. They just think about Al Capone for some reason.
Yeah. Yeah, also people seem to think it's on the West Coast, which is kind of funny, but then it also makes me realize like I don't know anything about European geography
Exactly.
either. I have a lot of colleagues in Germany that will tell me like, yeah, I'm from Munich, and I'm like, I don't know where Munich is.
Or what that
Dude.
means, or what like the cultural connotation of being from Munich is. It's like, yeah, that's a city
Right.
I've heard of.
Spirit's still good, even though I don't think it's gotten any upgrades. Still my favorite fun tempo deck. I have been playing the Rogues deck with uh, the Fairy Mastermind. So I want to talk to you about that because the thing, my takeaway is this: like, it's a very different version of Rogues than what I was used to previously because it's not playing like into the story. It's not benefiting as much from opponents having big graveyards apart from just drown in the lock and maybe like eventually some of your rogues getting slightly bigger. um, but the reason why I thought the deck is still pretty good is because of a card that's not a rogue, and that's just Shieldred. Like, it's just a great Shieldred package where you can play like some good early threats and some cheap interaction, and then eventually you can turn the corner with Shieldred, which is basically Murktide Regent, and a lot of decks just can't get past her.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the list that I played last week when I was testing this out did not have Shieldred in it as a top end. And as soon as Shane and I were talking about the show, I was like, oh yeah, that would certainly give the deck some power, because I really felt like it petered out as far as threats go.
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to play it a
It's
little?
an honorary rogue.
Yeah, I guess, right? I mean, it's weird that the one from March of the Machine has the rogue clause on it. Like, it can't transform unless an opponent has 8 cards in their graveyard, which is like, okay, so we are getting a payoff from rogues. But I've seen some people talking about that being a good fit for the deck. I think that the regular Shieldred's just better. Like, I mean, the other one, the newer one, is like too complicated. Also, why are there so many Shieldreds? Can we not with this?
I would like to say that I think I remember seeing in the notes that you were, or I was in the notes or in the Discord, but you were saying that you didn't like the Rogues deck, or maybe it was the episode last week. I would like to mention that I've played against this deck 10 times on stream, and I'm 0-10 against it.
Really?
So I don't know how anybody ever loses with Rogues. I can't beat it with anything.
Yeah.
So yeah, deck's great. Deck's cracked.
Maybe it's my problem.
deck is
Like
cracked.
usual, I'm like, yeah, this deck, I don't know. And then people are like, I'm 11 and 0. I'm 1,000 and 0 with this deck right now. How could you go 2 and 3 in a league with it?
Yeah. And then just in terms of like playing with Fairy Mastermind, I think it's only good because it's another flying flash rogue. Like,
Agree.
it's templating is what makes that a good card. The added ability of drawing extra cards when your opponent draws a second card is like, it doesn't come up super often, and if it does, it's only because like maybe on their end step you pay the 4 mana so that you draw 2, they draw 1, which I think is scary, but you're still getting card advantage in that exchange. So maybe that's like just something you have to take your medicine and hope that your 2 draws are better than their 1.
Yeah.
Yeah, most people don't really want to play into it. I don't think I've seen a lot of my opponents activate that effect, but honestly, it feels like much more of an aggressive deck where it's like just playing a 2-drop, aggressively milling to get to the Lord and the Thieves Guild Enforcer. It feels like much more of a beatdown deck than it was before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Kaito helps with that too. Like, this is my first time playing with Kaito Shizuki, and the like draw a card if you attacked with a creature this turn, or like loot if you haven't attacked. You never loot. Like, you just are always attacking because you have like so many flyers now between the Fairy Mastermind and the Soaring Sky Thief, and even like a lot of decks are playing 1 to 3 Nighthawk Scavengers as well. So,
Yeah. All right.
deck is
Well,
cool and fun.
contradicting my review of rogues, but that's okay. We're all about bringing everybody's viewpoints forward here.
All right, so the last deck that I played was really in anticipation of this episode, and it's one of the ones that Devon has provided for us graciously. And it's kind of like a sequel to what we talked about last week, where I played Gruul Elves featuring Ancient Imperiosaur. So last week I played Imperiosaur in a deck full of goblins. Today I played Imperiosaur in a deck full of elves, which was fun and nice because I have tons of experience with Golgari elves, which I know, Devin, you've been picking up Xbox Greg's List a little bit as well over the last few weeks. So it'll be nice to compare our experiences with those 2 similar but different strategies, because I had some feelings.
Yeah, I even so this one that we're going to talk about is green red. I also tried I've tried so many versions of decks with the ancient Imperiosaur. I tried a version that was like green black and basically just used Imperiosaur as like your like the normal elves deck, but Imperiosaur was your core convoke spell instead of Court of Calling.
Mm-hmm.
But this deck in particular, it's like, yeah. So this is essentially an aspiring spike deck. That's where I don't know if you guys watched this, but he decided to get into the Pioneer queues for a little bit because he had like a really good idea. And I didn't. The only thing that I changed from his deck list was I cut Elvish Visionary for Torch Courier, or excuse me, for Elvish Visionary for Jasper Ascendal because I wanted an additional 1-drop to like kind of like convoke out the dinosaur.
Yeah.
But the idea here is you're maxing out on 1-drops. You have Torch Courier as a 1-mana 1/1 for that basically can sacrifice itself to give a creature haste. And then you kind of have like an elves package here, Twin Elite War Master, to give you tokens, which help you convoke out your giant fat dinosaur, Ancient Imperiosaur, and then you sacrifice the courier to give it haste. And then Fierce Empath is kind of cool too, because it's an elf, which, you know, gets pumped by Visionary and triggers off of the Elvish War Master, but it also just more copies of Imperiosaur. So you effectively have 12 copies of that thing in this deck, and deck was pretty good. I was a big fan of it.
Yeah. And what I was really surprised while playing with it is that it actually still plays out a lot like Golgari Elves because your package is so similar. And to me, it just seemed like Imperiosaur is just Shaman of the pack, and Fierce Empath is Corda Calling. You know what I mean? And it's like
Yeah.
otherwise everything is the same. Torch Courier is the one like wild card, and that's just like filling up the Elvish Visionary or Llanowar Visionary 2 of slots, right?
But also, playing Imperiosaur with haste is a powerful drug. Like, my
Yeah, sure.
goodness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sure. Oh yeah, it's fantastic. Actually, I pulled it off as well, and I couldn't believe my opponent let me do it. And it was another example. I mentioned this last week too, where it's like Imperiosaur doesn't have to be a 2020 to just win on the spot, especially if it has haste. And like sometimes you just make it like a 14 or a 16 trampler with ward, and then you give it haste, and it's like you've managed to get enough chip damage maybe early on with some other elves, and then the dinosaur is essentially just like your big payoff at the end.
Yeah, or Shocklands or Thoughtseizes. Like, people, all kinds of things happen still, even in this format. So,
And there's some spots where you just have a couple of like I know it sounds weird because you need 7 creatures to cast the Imperiosaur, but there's sometimes where you just have like 10 or 11 creatures in play and you tap 7 of them, sack the Torch Courier, and you still have other stuff to attack. So even if they have a blocker, they're just going to die to the other creatures attacking anyways.
Yeah. So when it occurred to me that like the dinosaur is filling in the Shaman of the Pack slot for discussion purposes, like it got me thinking like what is the reason for playing this over Golgari? When in order to get the Imperiosaur out like cheaply, you still need a big board. And like it benefits from having a big board the way Shaman of the Pack benefits from having a big board. And when you're sacrificing Collected Company for Empath, which is like Empath only has one target here, and although it's nice to cord for Empath in some cases and to like have Imperiosaur up, you know, on your first main phase, um, I wasn't necessarily sure that this was like solving specific problems in the main, and if anything, it maybe just changes your post board games because like now you can play Rending Volley. Rending Volley was the red post board deck we had in our list, but like you could play other red spells now too. Like you could run Fries if you're worried about the control matchup or whatever. So
Yeah, the way that I look at it is I kind of view this as more of a combo deck where you're trying to set up like so you have Torch Courier and then you have Court of Calling, so that's 8 copies of Torch Courier, right? And then you
mhm.
have Empath, Imperiosaur, Court of Calling, which are now 12 copies of Imperiosaur. So essentially the way that I look at it is 12 copies of 12 copies of A and then 8 copies of B, and all you're trying to do is just assemble A plus B. The Elves plan is more of like it's not the Elves plan is think of it like as plan like B minus or C plus kind of thing, where it's only facilitating your plan A because it's making a lot of tokens off of Elite and War Master. One thing that I was considering is maybe trying to make this like a Jund deck and just play Torch Courier and then also play Shaman of the Pack to kind of combine the synergies. I haven't really fleshed out a list yet, but I think that could be a good idea too.
And it's playing Shaman instead of Fierce.
Yeah, you would. I think you would go down to like one Fierce Empath at that point because you would still want to
Yeah.
be able to cord for it, but
Yeah.
you can make the deck like a lot more toolboxy in that regard.
You probably actually only need one shaman in that case, right? And like you can play more fierces to have fodder, or maybe 2 and 2, like a couple of fierces to get extra copies of Imperiosaur, and then a couple shamans. So like sometimes you draw one, but really like the best shaman plays are the ones where you're cording for it, or like you play
Right.
shaman and then cord for the second one.
When you talk about the synergy between Court of Calling and Imperiosaur, what you're talking about doing is using Cord to go get Fierce Empath so that you can get Imperiosaur at that someone's end step or something like that. Before we get letters or tweets.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you could cord for 10, right? Or cord for 7, I guess. You're only going to get a 6/6, but
Hey, it has trample and ward too. Come on. Stan, did you like this deck? Would you keep playing this Elves kind of build? You have been playing a lot of Imperiosaur lately. Does it make you like this card more than last week, less, or?
I think I'm neutral, and I think I'd rather play it in Goblins, because what I liked about that version was that like you could you had more tools to give it haste. Like you had 8 bushwhackers, or maybe it was 7 bushwhackers, but you had bushwhackers, right? Which I thought was really nice. Though you had fewer ways to like get the green pips in its convoke cost. So I think that's one of the trade-offs. But yeah, like the part that I haven't fully cracked is like, what is this doing for elves in Pioneer, which was already like kind of good. Like, so Devon, you mentioned like to you this is more of a combo deck, but like, isn't elves already kind of a combo deck that has a beatdown plan and a combo plan?
kind of. But I think this is more. I think this is a response to Pioneer becoming a faster format. I think this deck has faster goldfishes. I think you're a little bit more consistently killing on turn 4, and like there is a randomness to Collected Company, right? Sometimes you cast collect. I mean, I posted a tweet the other day. There were 6 lands in the top 6 cards in my library. That's
Yeah,
going to happen sometimes.
I love
So
that.
there's a lot more randomness, and I feel like this deck is a little bit more consistent at getting those turn 4 kills. And as Pioneer becomes a faster format, I think that's a good place to be.
Yeah. Does it change your keep mull decisions at all? Like I'm still keeping.
Mm,
I found myself like I'm still just keeping hands that are like let couple 1-drops, War Master, and 3 lands, and I was like, yeah, I mean this is going to be the foundation, and then I have to just sort of figure it out from here.
Sometimes I'll like mulligan a 7 that doesn't have one of the combo pieces. Like if I don't have an empath or a or access to, well, I guess you don't really want to like mold a torch courier, but you do kind of want to have at least one dino in your opening hand. But this deck also doesn't mulligan the best because it
Yeah.
does need a lot of stuff in play to actually cast its convoke cards. So it is a little bit tough in that regard.
So overall, I think it's good.
And I mean, clearly you think that, Devon, you think that this deck is reasonably good, or at least Ancient Imperiosaur is important right now, because the next deck that we have to talk about is the deck that you're going to play today, and it's another Imperiosaur deck.
Ancient Imperiosaur is kind of messed up.
I agree.
The more I play with that card, I'm just like, whoo boy.
After
That card is a lot.
After this week, I was very surprised, I guess I would say, that it just feels like a lot of people are playing it online to try to figure out how to use it, and it's just like the giantest burst kill available in Pioneer right now, and I'm surprised by that. Like, Stan, when you talked about this card in the spoilers, I was like, this is cool, maybe this is a payoff for elves, or this is something interesting like that, but this is just like a big area to explore, I think, for people both in Pioneer and Modern.
And I think there's just a lot of different ways to approach building it. Like you saw the last list that's kind of more all in with the torch couriers. I mean, this deck list that we're about to look at is basically just Gruul boats with cutting Sky Sovereign for Ancient Imperiosaur, and almost nothing else is different. And I think that's just a decent approach. Like you don't have to go super all in on the card. As we talked about, even if you're only tapping 3 or 4 creatures for it, you're still getting a 12/12 or a 14/14 that's likely still going to kill your opponent in one shot.
So like Devon said, this is basically Gruul boats. And what's that made up of, right? So it's your 8 elves, you're tapping elves. It's Bone Crusher Giant, Lovestruck Beast, Reckless Stormseeker, which is what a card Reckless Stormseeker is. I played this deck last night too. I hope I didn't blow any surprises. I only played it in tournament practice last night, so I didn't want your list to get out of the before the showcase.
That's fine.
It's got a couple of the utility S cards. It's got Scavenging Ooze, Werewolf Pack Leader, and I think those are all the cards that are in it. The 2 Braids, 2 Lightning Strike, Esika's Chariot, again, what a card, and the Crow and War. I have never played Gruul boats before. Like, I'd never gotten around to it. I just kind of seen it happen. And I am very much not I'm not like a Gruul player. I am not turn 1 elf player generally. Like, I'm more turn 1 lightning bolt player. So, I'm blue-red spells guy generally.
You want to kill my elf.
Exactly. I have to say, though, and I'm excited to hear you talk about this deck some more, but I have to say, this deck, I only played it for like 5 or 6, 7 matches last night. This deck may have changed me, though, especially when it comes to Pioneer, because this was so much fun. Honestly, I was like, wow, these are powerful cards, and then sometimes you just kill somebody with a hasty 2020.
Yeah, when you look at your opening hand and you have, the like turn 1 elf, turn 2 Stormseeker, turn 3 Chariot, that's the dream curve. If your opponent doesn't interact with your elf on turn 1 and you just get to go turn 2 Stormseeker, turn 3 Chariot, like there's not really many decks in the format that could beat that draw. That even like the best, even that hand sometimes even beats the best mono green draws. So you have like that out. You just have a ton of just raw power, like the Bone Crusher Giant Lovestruck Beast. Those cards are really good against Rakdos because they just provide straight up 2-for-1s. So you have like a good amount of card advantage. You have creature lands. It's just, this deck just kind of has everything. And then you have the fast kill with Imperiosaur now.
Yeah. So have you been doing well with this deck so far, or are you just coming back to it because you know that you like the boat's shell and you're like, that's why I'm playing it today, because I've tried some other things. I wasn't sure what was going on your stream this week, for example.
This week I tried a little bit of Izzet Pyro, which we'll maybe get to after this, and I had some moderate success with that, but I top 8'd the challenge last week with not this exact deck list, but I think I only changed like 3 or 4 cards, and it felt very good. And I just kind of wanted to be a little bit more aggressive.
Do you really think the Pioneer's becoming a faster format? I did want to come back to that in a minute, because you mentioned that a minute ago, and then so what kind of things do you feel like is making that happen right now?
I think the resurgence of mono green is because of Pelucranos. So the resurgence of mono green has kind of like made people adjust to be able to keep up with the pacing of mono green, because that deck can produce 12, 15 mana on turn 3 or turn 4. So you really have to be like a lot more proactive if green starts showing up again. We had a period in Pioneer where before Mom came out, green had kind of fallen off a little bit, and there was a lot more Rakdos, a lot more blue-white, a lot more of these interactive decks. And once green starts showing up again, green usually beats up on those decks. So you have to be the terms of engagement change when green is a popular, a pillar of the format, and that's kind of where I think most of it is stemming from.
I want to jump back into this Gruul Dino deck. So looking at the deck list, like it looks very similar to Gruul boats, with like essentially you're just swapping the Sky Boat for main deck Imperiosaur.
Mm-hmm.
Like otherwise, like the texture and the game plan seems to be pretty similar. And thinking back on like the rise of Gruul boats, it was a response to the popularity of Rakdos, right? Like just because Sky Sovereign was like practically unwinnable for the Rakdos matchup, like unless they were able to Thoughtseize them all out of your hand. Does that matchup change at all when you like change your payoffs here, or is Esika's Chariot still able to kind of like help carry you along the way against mid-range strategies in general?
So Imperiosaur is, significantly worse against Rakdos than Sky Sovereign. I will agree with that. But the rest of your deck is so good against them. You have the 4 Chariots. You have the adventure spells to get 2-for-1s. You have a pile of creature lands. You have a Crow and War to steal Shield Rid. So you just have... I think you still have enough tools, even without playing the Sky Sovereigns. I did beat Rakdos 3 times in the challenge last weekend. And, it still feels like a good enough matchup. Like, with Sky Sovereign, you're basically, 80-20 against them. Without Sky Sovereign, maybe you're closer to, like, 65-35 or 70-30. I think the matchup is still good, but not quite as good.
I did want to talk about the Crow and War for a minute, because this is a card that I have zero exposure to playing until I played this deck list last night. So it is mostly
busted.
Yeah, it's a good card, but is it mostly, it's mostly about taking Shieldred? Is that, I mean, it has general utility, but is it really in there to prop up that against that particular card, or what do you think?
So the biggest reason to play a Crowan War is the rise of mono green.
Okay.
You can imagine a curve where you go turn 2, Reckless Stormseeker, attack for 3. They play Pelucranos, and you go a Crowan War, steal your Pelucranos, hasted, attack you for 7.
Right.
They're dead. Like, the game's just over right
Right.
there. So it's mostly actually more for mono green than it is for Shield Rid, but it happens to have some added utility. And also the sick thing about a Crowan War is when you have Esika's Chariot, you can respond to the third chapter in a Crowan War by using their creature to crew with the third chapter on the stack and then resolve the third chapter. So in the case of Shield Rid, because it has Death Touch, you crew with the Shield Rid, and then the Shield Rid is now tapped for the third chapter of a Crowan War, deals 4 damage to itself, and because it has Death Touch, it dies.
Yeah. Wow. I gotta tell you, I figured that one out myself last night. I was like, this third chapter, I can do this, and I was like, Esika's Chariot. Like, it wasn't Shieldred, it was a different card that I was like, if I need to tap this to get it out of the way when I give it back to them, so I can still attack profitably, because it was like something that had big toughness. And
Yeah.
I was proud of myself, Devon. I was like, okay, I can do this.
Nice.
I can do this.
Yeah. This chapter's on the stack for a reason.
Right.
Yep.
I guess the other thing I wanted to ask a little bit about, because I do think this is kind of like the deepest we'll go into a deck today, is so help me understand Mutavault a little bit. So Mutavault, I know it's a good aggressive card. It doesn't have any synergies here. We're not playing 4 of them. We're just playing 2 of them. Is this a little bit of like a sneaky way to get an extra creature in for Convoke for Imperiosaur, or is it just a good card and you have space for a couple of them? I was wondering if I was missing something there.
No, mostly just a good card. It does come up sometimes with Imperiosaur, but honestly, the thing about Mutavault, so the other boats list, like before we added Imperiosaur to the deck, were actually, I think I was on like 4 Mutavault for a while. And the biggest thing that it does is specifically with Stormseeker, like you don't even have to have the Mutavault in play. You can just go, play it for turn, activate it, target it with Stormseeker. So it just allows you to give you like these more burst damages. It's really good against Blue Eye because it gets to dodge sweepers. You get to have something left over, and that matchup is kind of tough. But yeah, there's really no synergies outside of maybe I don't think it's ever actually come up with Ancient Imperiosaur for me, but mostly this just there is an aggressive card that gives you some insurance against sweepers.
Got it. Okay. Cool.
And we cut the 2, by the way, because I added Pack Leader. It's hard to play 4 when you have the double green 2 drop.
Yeah, Pack Leader is a cool card. That's another card in this list that, like I said, I hadn't played until this time. It was interesting to see how much people respect that card. I had a lot of people who pulled it out of my hands with Thoughtseize or killed it as soon as it hit the board. And I was like, you really should have taken Reckless Stormseeker. I don't know what. Maybe that's just because I was in tournament practice, but like. People are scared of that card because they don't want you to draw cards. Basically, it feels like, which was pretty interesting.
Yeah, and like turn 2 Pack Leader, turn 3 Stormseeker, haste, attack for 6, draw a card. Like that curve is so sick too.
Yeah, and it's kind of like it gives you more outs to the flip side, where it's like, okay, I didn't get Esika's Chariot, but I did get Stormseeker, and my 2 drop is just as good now in some ways.
I wish they would just let me play with 8 Stormseekers. I think I would play. I'd play at least 8.
Card is amazing. Never flipped it once. Who cares? Who cares?
Don't have to.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, I think that, we could go on and look at some other decks. I thought this deck was really cool. I might be a Gruul Boats person in Pioneer now. We'll see, or Gruul, whatever we want to call this, Gruul base in Pioneer for a little bit and see how that goes.
We converted him.
Yeah, because it definitely went better than Izzet Pyro, I will say. And so I'd love to hear you talk about that list a little bit, Devon. Stan, I don't know if you've looked at or played with these new Pyro lists. Part of the reason that I played this deck as well, part of the reason that I wanted to try this deck is just because it had one of the cards that I felt like I brought to the spoiler table when we were talking, which was Meeting of Minds, which I think is just probably a good card. And I felt like, for what it's worth, before we get really deep into this deck right now and in this meta, I do feel like this deck sort of confirmed that Meeting of Minds is a card that is worth playing, and it is a card that's worth having in your toolbox. It is not super duper powerful or something like that. It's like it's no Treasure Cruise, but I think it is a card that can be the glue for a deck kind of like this. But Devon, you said you played this week a lot. How did you feel about Pyro? Has it worked for you?
So I kind of had some up and down. So I had I posted a 5-0 on Monday. That's where I really started really started playing it. So did well on Monday, ended up playing it again. I actually went to F&M on Friday, went a 4-0 there, and then decided to play it in the challenge yesterday, and then a 0-3 dropped. So had a little bit of mixed results, but overall, I've been very, very, happy with the deck list overall. The one thing, it looks like a really small change to go from Of One Mind to Meaning of Mind. But the really important thing is the fact that it's an instant.
Yeah.
And because of that, I actually think I want to change up the removal spells. I have 2 roast in here, but I think those should just be more instants to help you just kind of hold up Meaning of Minds. It lets you kind of play like that controlling type game, which this deck didn't necessarily have access to before. But yeah, I've been really impressed with that. Meeting of Minds being a free cantrip has also been kind of sick.
Yeah, I also wonder why we don't have any Stoke the Flames in here. Like if we're playing so many convoke cards while also like making so many tokens, like Stoke the Flame just sort of seems like a shoe in here.
I have wanted Stoke the Flames to be good for so long in Pioneer.
For 20 years.
I mean, it was so good in Standard. It was a card that was really fun. It doesn't kill Sheoldred is the main reason that I was kind of like, that's part of it. And it doesn't kill like Cavalier of Thorns. And like, so it's in this weird space where it's like, how many X4s do you want to kill with it? But it does Dome. And so I do think it's an interesting question. I played against a list last night that stoked the flame me at one point, and I was like, is this gonna happen in Pioneer finally? Is it happening? You do make a lot of tokens in this deck. You really do. Like, I mean, it's not like some of these earlier versions or some of the decks that were running Pyromancers like Plan B in old kind of, Pioneer 6 months ago. You make a lot of when it's working, it's working.
Yeah, the list I actually started with before I 5-0'd was actually a list that had Invasion of Segovia and Stoke the Flames as like a natural pairing, because Segovia has 4 toughness. You can play it, you get 2 tokens, you can use those tokens to crew the Stoke or convoke the Stoke the Flames, target the Segovia, flip it, untap. You can do some like really cool stuff there. But I was really unimpressed with Segovia every time I cast it. Stoke the Flames was like okay, but Dave brought up a good point. Doesn't kill Shield, doesn't kill Pelucranos. The biggest reason, honestly, and this is, just kind of a common theme in Pioneer at this point, is you lose Gigantha. So that's honestly the biggest reason to not play Stoke the Flames. Gigantha's broken. Just every deck that can play Gigantha, it's like, I know it sounds like a really weird statement to say, but free cards are good. Just good.
Stan is looking skeptical.
I always forget to factor in the Gigantha mana. Yeah. Although I didn't play this deck today, I actually played a similar version of this deck in the March of the Machine Arena Access event. I got invited by the kind folks at Wizards of the Coast, and I got to play basically this in Explorer, which, like, I was playing Stoke the Flame and Meeting of the Minds, and Ledger Shredder too. Like, so I love that you have Ledger Shredder. That just seems like sort of the understated one of the most important cards to like play in any of these like 8 Pyro spells decks, just because you end up like with so much air. Like, I love Shredder not as a beater as much as a way to just like filter out extra dens or Spiral of Canals, or just like getting to the spells, because you need to have spells to cast. And it's interesting, like this versus something like Murktide, even, where like in Murktide, you're drawing so many cards that you can sometimes bin spells that aren't good in a matchup, like counter spells or whatnot. But here, all of your instant sorceries tend to be so proactive that Ledger Shredder is sort of like the glue that I think secretly makes decks like these work, while also like putting dumb cards into the bin for Treasure Cruise.
Yeah, and speaking of crews too, Shredder is also really good in the post-board games when your opponent has a lot of graveyard hate, because you can just get rid of those cruises. One thing that I realized after playing this deck is I probably should have some Braids in my sideboard to be able to kill Hearse, because I couldn't beat that card when my opponent had it on turn 2. So that's probably something I would look to do moving forward. But yeah, deck was great. I loved it a lot.
I had rough matchups. I think I did league with this deck and I went like 1-4, which happens because I'm not very good, but it is what it is. And I had this kind of thing happen where, number one, Devon, I lost a bump in the night. Have you played against this like blood token deck? Have you seen this deck?
I've seen it floating around. It's like what the not Sanguine's Blood. It's like Sovereign's Bite,
Yes.
2 mana Lava Spike. You gain 3 or whatever.
And they make 2 blood tokens. Then they shrapnel blast you.
I have seen that deck.
that was kind of the last round. It was the last straw, and I was like, never pyroing in Pioneer again. Give me some elves.
Once you get in the bump of the night bracket, then you know you're in a rough spot.
This is my concern, Devon. Yeah, exactly.
I'm confused. Bump of the Night's not Pioneer League.
So it's not, but it's basically like a burn deck. It's a red-black burn deck that uses these really kind of, it's madness based too. So it uses these weird cards. Maybe they'll become like a mainstream deck, but it's kind of, you know how Bump of the Night and Burn is just like, it does nothing other than 3 damage to your opponent and you can recast it. This is a card that's kind of like, it costs a colorless and a black. It does 2 damage to your opponent. You gain 2 life and you make 2 blood tokens. And so it's just this like, yes, that's what it's called. It's just this like nothing card where I was like, I can't believe somebody's beating me with this. And then there's another one that's madness enabled. That's like a 4 CMC card from Shadows over Innistrad that costs 1 black when you madness it. And it is literal Bump in the Night. It's like 3 damage to you and you gain 3 life. 3 damage to your opponent. You gain
Alms of the Vein.
Yeah, that's what it's called. Yeah, exactly. So it's someone playing.
I don't know why I know all these cards. But.
It's like black direct damage stuff where it was very tilting, I will say. But I did have one concern that I had about this deck in general is like this deck does not interact with large threats very well. Like Ancient Imperiosaur was like, I had 0 outs against a resolved Ancient Imperiosaur, which maybe a lot of decks don't have any outs against that. And then on the flip side, I had a hard time against like blue-white control, which is kind of weird because their wraths, this deck was sort of like not fast enough for me to be able to commit to the board a lot without getting really punished by Supreme Verdict, basically. And so it was kind of like tough navigating for me to figure out like, okay, where are we going to go? Like, how am I going to, it just felt like maybe I drew like the bad matchups generally. So what decks do you think this deck is well positioned against in Pioneer right now? If you say blue-white control, I'm going to be really sad.
No, I think the blue-white matchup is really close. It's all about like threat pacing, as traditional blue-red versus sweeper decks. You want to be like commit 1 threat at a time, have some cantrips. You do have a lot of dead cards against them too, so it's probably, I would say, a close matchup overall. I think this deck is meant to beat up on the more fair deck, so I think it in theory should have an okay matchup against Rakdos. You have enough ways to get rid of Shield Rip between Roast and the counter spells. You have 4 Treasure Cruise. Your threats all produce extra bodies, so you're all like kind of 2 for 1-ing in all these spots. So I think that should be an okay matchup. This deck crushes, like the aggressive decks, crushes mono white. I think it's pretty good against Gruul boats. The problem with this deck is it's bad against the other unfair decks, and that's what I played in the challenge yesterday, which is when I went 0-3, I lost to Lotus Field, Mono Green, and I think those are all tough matchups, which could maybe be helped out by changing the sideboard counter configuration around, change the equation, not countering Karn, kind of rough. So you could maybe tweak some numbers to make your fast matchups a little bit better, but yeah, this is like kind of not the king, but the like sort of the anti-fair deck tech or something like that, I guess is what to put it.
Yeah. Is that Phoenix too? Like, would Phoenix fill
something
that
like
role?
That. Yeah, it's basically think of it like Phoenix, but it's a little less reliant on the graveyard because you have Shredder, you have the 8 Pyromancers, so you're a little bit better against graveyard hate. But it's trying to occupy the same spot as Phoenix in the metagame. Yeah.
Really quick, Chrome hosts Seed Shark. You have a couple in your sideboard. Worth it?
Yep. We call that for the grindy matchups. Well, I finally cast it for the first time the other day against my control opponent, and then I immediately followed up with a Treasure Cruise and made an 8, an 8 Incubate 8 or whatever. Yeah. So that felt pretty good. I haven't cast it that often, but it does feel like it's a fairly powerful card in those kind of grindy matchups. It's kind of like another Pyromancer, but it offers a little bit more flexibility in terms of giving you, if you can slam it with the Treasure Cruise, it gives you this massive threat. So I think I like it as a 1 or 2 of.
Mm-hmm. I did come away from playing this having a little bit more respect for Make Disappear, which is just a good card. I think it's a good card in this deck. It's not too bad without the casualty, and then it's just absurd with it, where you're kind of like 2 for a 4 mana leak is interesting. I also like to change the equation, all right, but I can definitely see that that's like, hey, this is very matchup based, very meta based. You can switch around, but I was surprised again, given our discussion on the spoiler episode, but we've checked in on this card a couple times. I do think that card is like fine part of Pioneer's counter suite. Like it's just a card that's reasonable to have around. It has enough utility. Yeah. And I loved Outpost Siege as well, which is just a callback to, a limited format I loved. And but it's a good card. It's a good way to like draw some extra cards, have a top end if you need, as Devon said, for the grindy matchups, you need the extra cards.
Yeah, and a lot of people in my chat ask about Outpost Siege, like why not, some other card draw spell. The reason is you make a lot of tokens, and sometimes you just name dragons or whatever the second mode on that card is, and you put yourself in a spot where you're like your opponent's at 10 and you have 10 tokens. Right. I'll name dragons, attack you with my 10 tokens. You're just no matter what you do, you're dead. So
Outpost Siege. All right, so I think Izzet Pyro. I know I'll go back to blue red, even though this was not a great run with it. But I do think that the deck is real. Balmor was pretty cool to see in here too. I have to say, I did kill somebody on like turn 4 with Balmor and a few tokens, and they had fiery impulsing their board. Just being like, okay,
that card, by the way, it's just the perfect one of.
Yeah.
You never want the second copy, but it's the perfect one of.
Yeah. All right, so we have two decks left that we could talk about, I think, with the last couple minutes before Devon has to go on the challenge. Want to talk about Rakdos Ghalta, because I saw you talking about that on Twitter yesterday, actually, as well. What's going on with that deck right now? So this is sort of what we had, thought might happen, which is it's using Sorin to treating Ghalta and Mavrin, but this isn't just really completely a vampires deck. It's got some other stuff going on as well, right?
Yeah, so think of this as like kind of Rakdos mid-range with a combo finish. So you have your Fables, Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, and Bloodtithe Harvester, which happens to be a vampire, by the way, for Sorin. Just happens to be the best vampire. So you have like that kind of mid-range-ish package. And then you also have this other aspect to it where you have Voldaren Epicure and Harvester, which discard cards, so you can actually discard Ghalta and then get to Olivia, which is a way to get back Ghalta. So it actually gives you more ways to kind of get those like fast kills. Like Olivia hasting a Ghalta on turn 3 is a lot better than turn 3 put Ghalta into place, say go, right? Because you actually get the attack immediately. But at the end of the day, it's just trying to put Ghalta into play as quickly as possible. One thing I will mention about this deck is I actually kind of didn't like the Champion of Dusks, and I kind of want to just be more all in on like 4 Olivia, 4 Ghalta, and then also Bitter Reunion to discard the Ghalta to just set up the reanimation kill. I think that might be a better approach to it, but I like this deck. It's just it gets to play a good fair game and just has like this really sick end game. It was a lot of fun to play.
I think it's interesting. A lot of the decks that we've talked about today and recently is like good fair game. Like the boats deck is the same way. Good fair game. And then this like broken combo on top of it. Like it's pretty interesting that we've gotten some tools for that. I mean, I guess Mom has a lot of these like haymaker style cards in it, so maybe we shouldn't be too surprised that that's what's happening. But is that a trend, do you think, in Pioneer, that the medium decks are going to be able to pick up these like burst potential that just ends the game? I feel like that puts us in a like kind of not a Splinter Twin situation, but you know what I mean, where it's like, starting to adopt some of the characteristics, some of the decks that you see in Modern sometimes. What do you think?
Well, the thing about Pioneer is, the interaction kind of sucks, right? The best removal spell is Fatal Push by far, but past Fatal Push, there's like, all the removal is 2 mana or conditional. You don't have Unholy Heat, Prismatic Ending. There's Leyline Binding is very restrictive. Like you can play Binding, but there's no fetch lands. No Solitude, no Fury. So the removal is just generally a lot worse in Pioneer. And I think that's why you see a lot of these like either linear non-interactive decks or decks that are trying to adopt that kind of big end game is they're trying to take advantage of, well, not just the lack of removal, but also, again, as we talked about earlier, the increase in mono green. Like when the format goes towards mono green and decks that are beating mono green, the natural response to that is just you have to keep pace with them. Like you can't play a long game with mono green. They're going to bury you with Storm the Festival and bury you with Karns and all this stuff. So you just have to have this like, I need to get this game over with as quick as possible, or have the option to do that. You don't have to build your entire deck around it, but you need to have that avenue available.
Yeah. Awesome. Let's talk about the last deck on your list, Naya Tokens. This one is one of those ones that like I read the deck list, I looked at it, and I was like, A, I don't think I'm going to play this deck, but B, I don't even know what is going on here really that is the powerful synergy that's happening. To me, what was interesting was looking through this list and going like, this is a lot of standard cards in this list with a couple of like powerful things on top of it.
Yeah, so the idea here is I wanted to try out the new Elishnorn. That was actually a card that when I first read it, it felt really like it reads really powerful. Flip it and make just make 5 tokens immediately. The next turn they all get double strike. And the synergy here is you're pairing that with like a lot more ways to make tokens. You have Fable, Winning Announcement, Esika's Chariot, Prosperous Innkeeper, a way to make treasure to ramp you up. You're combining all of that with Mondrak, which doubles your tokens, and then you also have Voice of Resurgence, which you can sacrifice to Elishnorn or Mondrak. It's actually kind of cool with Mondrak because you sack the voice to Mondrak and you get 2 voice tokens because of the Mondrak's ability. So there's some kind of cool stuff you can do there. And then like Invasion of Ixalan kind of just ties the room together because it's just, finds basically everything in the deck with the exception of the 2 braids. So that's kind of like the synergy that we're going for, is just like, get a wide board, make a bunch of tokens, maybe flip a Winning Announcement, flip an Elishnorn, because Elishnorn's a lot. That card's really good.
I think it's really good too. The casting cost is like unbelievable on that card for what it does. It's like 4.
Even the first ability just came up quite a bit too. I was surprised at that.
Just the pay 2
whenever
life.
Source deals damage. Yeah, I was actually surprised how often that came up.
Interesting. So, but this one is not quite on your front burner for decks you're considering for wide field tournaments, like a challenge or something like that yet.
No, because this deck has no chance of beating mono green. Like if you just look at the cards, they just don't line up that well enough, and it's all about value. Like this deck, if you're expecting, like say if your metagame was, I don't know, 70 or 80% Rakdos, I don't know why it would be like that, but this is like the Rakdos killer, right? If you just look at all the cards, they all just line up so well against Rakdos. Yeah. But yeah, this is like can never beat mono green, can never beat Lotus Field, but really good against the fair decks. It's kind of like the space that it occupies.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think this has been a great trip through kind of Pioneer lists. Stan, did you have any other lists that you saw this week from your FNM that you thought were interesting? Or Devon, first pass at like the Rona deck. Any thought are you seeing that deck? Is it actually happening, or what do you think about that?
We could talk about the Rona deck. It's so weird because I played that deck like the first day that it came out, or like the first day that Mom came out. I played a couple of leagues, I think one with Jeskai, one with Sultai, and I don't know what it was, but I wasn't like super impressed with it. And then I see like Todd's crushing with it. I saw one of my friends, Brennan, who just won an RCQ with it yesterday, has kind of just been all over the place, and I don't know if I necessarily buy into it quite yet, but the deck is doing some really powerful stuff.
Gentlemen, good Deckfest as always. Before we wrap up, I do want to try something a little different on Mike. Literally, I was grocery shopping before we started the show, and I saw that the grocery store had a beverage called Iron Brew. Have you guys ever heard of Iron Brew before?
I have not. I've only heard of Iron City beer, which is why I kind of assumed that this was a beer when you mentioned it.
It's not a beer. So I've never had it either. And I'm not surprised you haven't heard of it because it's actually a Scottish soft drink. Okay. And I don't know if you can find it in all of England. I'm in northern England, right next to Scotland, so maybe it's a little bit more common here. I've never had it before. I don't know what to expect whatsoever. The Scots love it. My wife, who studied abroad in Scotland, hates it. And I thought it might be fun to just crack open a cold Iron Brew, try it on mic, and get a live reaction. For those at home who are not watching this on YouTube, Iron Brew looks like an orange soda. It's orange.
Yeah, I'm Googling it to try and see like if it can tell me what kind of flavor it has.
Yeah, don't tell me.
No, I'm not going to tell you.
Yeah, don't tell me.
Let's see.
I want to see. I'm trying to see what it is so that I can see your reaction and we can compare that to what it actually is.
That's funny.
Yeah, after I taste, if you find a description of the flavor, read it to me after I've tasted it, and then because I'll see if I can even describe it. So I have not opened this yet. Oh, that sounded good.
Oh, that ASMR.
Yeah. Join us for our new YouTube ASMR stream. We're going to have people snapping cards in their hands, people snapping cards, shuffling, and opening bottles.
Okay, so it smells like cream soda.
Okay.
Is the smell. By the way, on the bottle it says brewed spelled BRU''D, brewed in Scotland, a secret recipe since 1901. That's my
Secret
best.
recipe.
That's my best attempt at a Scottish accent.
That's good. We're gonna
Okay.
get Danny Boyle
All right.
on the line in a minute.
He's Mank. He's from Salford. Oh, this is good.
What does it taste like?
Well, okay,
First
it's
reaction.
sweet.
Okay.
It is
Sweet.
a soft drink. It's sweet. It's like a orange cream soda. Like
All right.
it's a little orange, but it's not like a Sunkissed or Orange Crush. But it has like the cream soda-ness to it. This is really, really tasty actually. Like this could be a refreshing like hangover beverage.
So what I found was it tastes like orange and blackcurrant to many people, but others have described its taste as fizzy bubblegum or even a sweetened version of Listerine.
That last one is like, all those sounds good. And the last one is
Yeah.
like, what? Wait,
What's
What?
that?
I'm not getting the Listerine, the blackcurrant, like that. There's definitely something there, and the fizzy bubblegum, there's something there. So yeah, it's not minty at all. Like the Listerine is unusual. It's not. It's to me, it's 0% minty.
Yeah.
All right.
But this
Good.
is really
there
tasty.
you go.
I'm gonna have to get some Iron Brew imported now.
We're starting a trend here. We'll get this clip on TikTok, and then pretty soon we'll be sponsored
we're going
by.
viral.
We'll go viral with Iron Brew reactions. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I could do more live British taste testing. Like next week, I'll just open a can of beans.
Perfect.
All right. That wraps up this week's show, Devon. I mean, at this point, the people know where to find you, but I think it would be poor form not to give you a chance to rep yourself.
Twitch.tv/DoomWake and Twitter, YouTube as well.
Yeah, and on the Dive Down, about every 2 to 3 weeks, I think is
Every
our
other
current
week.
Every other
cadence.
week
or
is where
something
we're
like
at.
that,
Even
yeah.
every other week.
Love it.
Yeah.
Love to see it.
Until
All right.
they asked me to be on the Tempo episode, and then
You're taking that week off. We understand. Yeah.
Look, we've already explained tempo. You can disagree with our takes or not, but we've solved it. Listeners, if you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to our podcast and get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you use Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and review. You can also reach out to us on Twitter at The Dive Down, all one word, or you can email thedivedown@gmail.com. You can also support our show at patreon.com/thedivedown and support us while wearing stuff. Buy our swag at thedivedown.com/store. You can support us while playing Magic Online with a Mana Trader subscription using promo code TheDiveDown2023, all one word. Gets you 10% off your first 2 months of renting Magic Online cards. You can get some amazing shaving soaps, body soaps, fragrances, and more over at Barrister and Mann using promo code TheDiveDown2023 for 15% off your first order. And save some money on paper cards at NRG, Nerd Rage Gaming. Promo code DIVE8 gets 8% off your order from them. As always, special thanks to the bands Nora and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and play more Pioneers!